Hello. Today I'm going to cover out of the Talmud of Emmanuel, the Gospel of Matthew. The core of the Gospel of Matthew was created by a different person, one knowledgeable of writing, namely on the basis of false and exaggerated information that was given to him by oral traditions. This person, he was a scribe named Philemon, the Gibeon, also interwove the information provided to him according to his understanding. It is true, as explained, that the records stolen by Judas Iscariot were destroyed by the priests, but their contents were orally handed down by Emmanuel's followers in a fragmentary and falsified form, and were recorded in the form of notes several times, and were rewritten over and over again, and were continuously supplied with falsifications over and over again in a new form. This is precisely so, as it happens when no original writing exists, and consequently, with each passing on, the story always becomes newly embellished and altered. Matthew himself never wrote a gospel. Rather, the whole thing has only been imputed to Matthew. And that core of Matthew's gospel, which corresponds in a certain wise to the Talmud Emmanuel text, leads directly back to Emmanuel's teaching, and had already been dictated to the Philemon, the Gibeon, when Emmanuel was on his way to India. Later he, Philemon, still dictated everything to a scribe named Joshua, who interpreted in his sole discretion, wrote down, and thus also thoroughly falsified the whole thing. From this, at a later time, the Gospel of Matthew was then put together from the three individual pieces that existed. The end product, the Gospel of Matthew, was then ultimately made, for which the exact time was the months of May, June, July, and August of the year 81. The work was definitively written and finalized by a literate Greek Jew who had converted to the new Christianity. The various individual pieces were lost, about which, however, also nothing is known. The exact developmental process of the origination of the Gospel of Matthew is a very long process and is no longer logically followable, as I lack the necessary records for it, which would be extremely difficult to elicit. Very important to pay attention to is the fact that it was common at and after Emmanuel's time to make writings under the names of the apostles in order to popularize the concepts of Emmanuel's messages. These writings, however, were not products of the apostles themselves, and were not even within their commission. Judas Iscariot was the only scribe, because everything was made by scribes who were not apostles. Thus, it was common at that time, all kinds of letters and writings were made and were falsely put into circulation in the name of Emmanuel's close disciples, that is, the apostles. This misuse of the names of the disciples or apostles served to give weight and credibility to the texts. So it is a fact that no disciple, as well as no apostle, later arising from Emmanuel's disciples, has ever left behind any personal text testimony except Judas Iscariot. There were only some letters which they, in the absence of their own knowledge of writing, dictated to scribes, who already falsified everything, however, while writing down what was dictated. Apart from the disciples of Emmanuel, there were, in addition to his mother, Maria, and Maria Magdalena, his confidant, associated with him in friendship. Also 17 female disciples, through whose teaching activities also some writings and letters were made by scribes, but these were completely burned by the resultant Christianity and the church, and thus the proof of the existence of the female disciples was destroyed. It arose from this that the knowledge about the existence of Emmanuel's female disciples was already destroyed early on by the resultant Christianity, that is, the Christian church, and only the knowledge about the existence of the male disciples was emphasized and received, and that up to the present day. As already explained, Matthew never wrote a gospel, and this also applies to other alleged disciples or apostles' writings. None of these at all lead back to a disciple or an apostle. The whole Matthew stuff in the New Testament is an invention and is based on all the different falsifications of the oral traditions of the first writing of Judas Iscariot, which was destroyed by the priests, from which falsified stories and legends were then fabricated. These ultimately led to the Gospel of Mathew, along with other created writings of various ones knowledgeable of writing, who deceitfully and slanderously spread their letters and writings under the names of the apostles, although they had never written any letters or other writings, as they themselves did not master writing and reading. The Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke was written by a literate woman named Fatima of Damascus. Luke, who was born a little more than 65 years after Emmanuel in Syria and died at the age of 84 in Greece, was not knowledgeable of reading and writing, which is why he allowed the story of Emmanuel to be written down by a woman knowledgeable of writing, in such a wise as he had heard everything by means of the Matthew story, in which case, however, all kinds of things have again been presented differently in the written record than it all really was. The Gospel of Mark. John Mark, who belonged to the Jerusalem early Church of Christ, was not the written author of the Gospel of Mark. Here, a scribe, who had converted to early Christianity, had his hand in play, and also the first Qumran records rendered certain services. His gospel was dictated to him by John Mark in the month of June of the year 69 AD or after Emmanuel, according to the Meier records. Thank you and have a good day.